Good to have you back. This is Environmental Intelligence, Episode 31. It's May 5th, 2026, your daily briefing on environmental, regulatory, science, and compliance developments that matter for Canadian professionals. Ontario relocates decades-old mine tailings in Nipissing First Nation after prior consultation failures. The federal government is accepting final input on its draft strategy for sustainable development through 2029. Ontario has completed a second relocation of historical mine tailings in Nipissing First Nation after an earlier attempt drew sharp opposition over inadequate engagement. A new industry analysis projects a $200 billion clean energy expansion for Canada if approval processes move more quickly. These three developments each carry immediate implications for how practitioners handle contaminated sites, permitting packages, and multi-jurisdictional compliance work this week. Ontario has now moved historical mine tailings from a Nipissing First Nation site after an earlier relocation plan collapsed under public opposition. The second move occurred with little advance notice, leaving open questions about how the province oversees long-standing mining waste and documents engagement with affected communities. Previous relocation attempts had already triggered formal complaints centered on insufficient consultation. The province completed the transfer quietly, which has prompted renewed attention to oversight mechanisms for legacy waste. For practitioners managing contaminated sites in Ontario, this sequence signals that relocation decisions will face closer examination on documentation and communication standards. Projects involving historical tailings now require explicit records of community input from the initial planning stage onward. Current files should incorporate engagement logs that demonstrate how exposure scenarios and end-use options were discussed with First Nations before any physical work begins. The absence of such records increases the risk of project delays or formal challenges later. Next steps include monitoring provincial announcements for any statements on enforcement or revised procedures that might apply to similar legacy sites across the province. The federal government is taking final comments on its draft 2026 to 2029 Sustainable Development Strategy before the document advances. Environmental and Climate Change Canada has opened the last window for technical input on targets that intersect with site assessment and remediation planning. Professionals working on contaminated sites or multi-jurisdictional projects should evaluate how the strategy's goals align with current compliance obligations. Submissions that address remediation timelines, risk assessment methods, or federal-provincial coordination carry particular weight right now. The consultation period closes imminently, so any comments on contaminated-sites policy must be filed through the established portal without delay. A recent industry report concludes that Canada could realize a $200 billion clean energy expansion if regulatory approvals accelerate. The analysis highlights bottlenecks in environmental impact assessment and permitting as primary constraints on project timelines. Consultants preparing baseline studies, impact assessments, and permitting packages for renewable energy developments will likely see increased demand. Firms should examine current resource allocation to ensure capacity exists for thorough documentation that withstands accelerated review schedules. The report ties faster approvals directly to Canada's ability to capture this economic opportunity, which means practitioners may encounter pressure to compress fieldwork windows while maintaining defensible data quality. Reviewing internal processes for efficiency without sacrificing technical rigor is advisable in the near term. Speaking of legacy tailings projects like the one in Nipissing First Nation, there is a practical sequence for community engagement that often determines whether technical work proceeds smoothly or encounters repeated setbacks. You arrive at a former mining property where decades-old tailings sit adjacent to a First Nation reserve, and earlier relocation attempts have already produced formal complaints. The technical tasks of characterizing tailings chemistry and mapping transport pathways must proceed alongside engagement that gives communities genuine input on exposure scenarios and long-term end uses. Senior practitioners recognize that analytical data packages by themselves seldom resolve underlying concerns. Transparent sharing of results, proposed cover designs, and monitoring commitments builds the credibility required to keep work moving forward. The most frequent error occurs when the Phase 2 investigation and conceptual site model reach completion before any community discussion takes place. This sequence forces reactive adjustments later, often after significant effort has already been invested. The practical adjustment is to schedule initial engagement meetings immediately after the first site reconnaissance. Indigenous knowledge of local water use patterns and seasonal conditions can then shape the sampling plan and risk assessment scope from the outset rather than arriving as an afterthought. This approach reduces the likelihood that later findings will contradict community expectations or require costly redesigns. If you are working on contaminated sites files involving historical mine tailings in Ontario, review the adequacy of documented community engagement in every active project this week. Submit technical comments on the draft federal Sustainable Development Strategy before the current window closes. Reassess resource planning for clean energy project approvals in light of the reported need for shorter regulatory timelines. Incorporate early-stage community consultation checkpoints into standard operating procedures for any legacy waste relocation work. Fast. Mark your calendar for final feedback on the federal Sustainable Development Strategy through the Environment and Climate Change Canada portal this week. Monitor Ontario announcements regarding the Nipissing International First Nation tailings relocation for any new compliance expectations that may affect similar sites. Track updates on approval process reforms referenced in the recent Canadian Mining Journal report, as these could influence permitting timelines for renewable projects in multiple provinces. Tomorrow, watch for further details on how accelerated clean energy approvals might alter standard environmental assessment scopes in practice. That's environmental intelligence for today. If this briefing is useful to your practice, share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. We're back tomorrow. Have a productive day. This podcast is curated by Patrick but generated using AI voice synthesis of my voice. The primary reason to do this is I unfortunately don't have the time to be consistent with generating all the content and wanted to focus on creating consistent and regular episodes for all the themes that I enjoy, and I hope others do as well.